everyone, I'm Emily Finch, and thank you for joining us for our first ever attempt at a virtual wildflower walk during the stay-at-home order. I hope that all of you are staying safe and healthy at home, but also getting out and enjoying a lot of our great natural resources. So I am here representing the Daviess-Martin CISMA, or Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. We're a local group that's been around for a little over a year, covering Daviess and Martin counties in southern Indiana. And the group includes people like myself that work for local agencies. I am the invasive species specialist for DuBois, Daviess, and Martin counties, soil and water conservation districts. We also have a ton of great volunteers, a lot of local landowners that are passionate about controlling and managing our invasive species in the area, and we're passionate because we love protecting a lot of our special places. Today we're at the Bluffs of Beaver Bend Nature Preserve, just outside of Shoals. To get here, just go south of Shoals and turn on Spout Springs Road. There's a small parking lot here, and for easy access you can walk along the road coming in and going past the gate, just past the parking lot. There's a lot of wildflowers to see right from the road. And if you want a bit more of a challenge, you can take the trail up to the top of the bluffs, either just to see the views or to take a nice, I think, 2.5 mile loop trail that goes through the woods. So it is places like this that we really care about, and our native plants, as to why we want to control invasive species so much, because this is really what we're protecting. So I'd also like to give a shout out to my husband Brian, who's behind the camera. Say hi, Brian.
Hello.
As the only member of my household, he is the only one during the stay-at-home order that is allowed within 6 feet of me. So I was very glad that he could come along with and help us shoot this video for you. So come along and we'll see what plants we can find. This right here is a very well-known spring ephemeral and probably one of my favorites. I was super excited that it was blooming today because it wasn't earlier in the week. This guy here is called Jack in the Pulpit. I've also heard it called Preacher in the Pulpit. And it is pollinated in a very interesting way. If you lift up this structure here, the flower isn't actually right there, it's at the very base. You notice how this is really dark here, the underside of the little hood? That's to trick flies. Flies will come in and fly in, and they'll see that it's light colored here at the base and dark at the top. So they feel trapped and they think, let's fly towards the light. The light must be the way out. And so they get tricked to flying towards the base to pollinate this plant. Later in the year, you'll notice a cluster of bright red berries that are here. And that's what happens after it's pollinated and this structure falls off. So you'll see this group of 3 leaves with a little stalk of bright red berries. Here we have one of our native Trillium species. People may be familiar with the 3 leaves of Trilliums. This one with the white flower just opened. It wasn't open earlier this week, and this is called drooping Trillium. Some people might confuse it with nodding Trillium, but according to the books I've looked up, nodding Trillium is found more in our northern counties, whereas drooping Trillium is found here farther south. So one of our very common wildflowers, but one that's hard to see the flower, is wild ginger. Wild ginger has these large, and they'll get bigger, almost fuzzy leaves. But at the base of the plant, right on the ground, it has this tiny little flower. And it's situated on the ground because a lot of the time ants or beetles will actually be the ones to pollinate them. Little insects like that also play an important role when it comes to a lot of our spring ephemeral flowers. Some of them will grow seeds that are actually covered in a fleshy coating, specifically designed to attract ants to them, The ants will take the seeds and eat that fleshy coating, but it helps the plants to disperse their seeds much further because obviously on the bottom of a woodland forest, there's not exactly a lot of wind or other forces to help them spread their seeds. As you walk along the road going into Bluffs of Beaver Bend, just be prepared to watch out for a sign that'll show you for the Nubbin Ridge Trail to take, even if you're just going to the top of the trail or if you want to take the full loop back. So right here we have two different wildflowers. The showier flowering one right now is called wild geranium, which has these larger pink flowers. And if you look at the leaves, it kind of reminds you of the geraniums you might have at home, even if it doesn't have the big clustered flower heads. And right behind it, we find probably one of our most distinctive wildflowers called mayapple. Mayapple tend to grow in colonies or clumps, and they have these giant umbrella-like leaves. And most people might leave it at that. But what you should look for is underneath the leaf, it will have a little hanging white flower. They haven't developed quite yet, but they might be starting. And then later in spring, a little green fruit, or the apple of mayapple. So here you can see them getting ready to start blooming. They aren't quite ready yet. So here we have two different wildflowers. The first is one that you might have growing in your very own lawn, which is a violet. There are lots of different species of violets, so I would recommend, if you want to know the specific species, that you look it up, take some good photos, or get some help from the Indiana Native Plant Society. They are experts at it and helped me prep for this little virtual adventure as well. The other one over here is a type of buttercup, which from looking it up, I believe is rough buttercup. And buttercups get their name because they have those shiny, buttery yellow flowers. So this taller plant here, even though it doesn't have super showy flowers, this is called blue cohosh. And you'll notice that it kind of has this like bluish, purplish tinge almost to the foliage. That's common when it first emerges, but its name doesn't come from its flowers or its foliage, but from later in the year, where you'll see a cluster of bright blue berries sticking up above this plant, which is pretty neat. Down below it, we also see another violet. This is our yellow violet. Yellow violets bloom a little bit after our normal purple wood violets, and they're also slightly rarer, so you're not as likely to find these ones spreading into your lawn. One of the wildflowers that always makes me happy to see are big clumps of our native phlox. Phlox are related to the garden phlox you might buy, but you'll notice that in the woods they're a lot smaller, even if they're just as showy. Now, some people sometimes plant invasive species called dame's rocket, or will pick the flowers thinking that it is phlox because the flower looks very similar. But an easy way to tell the difference is just by counting the petals. Phlox, spelled P-H-L-O-X, has 5 letters in its name, and if you look at the petals, it has 5 petals. Dame's rocket, which thankfully is not growing here, although it could because it's blooming later, Dame's rocket has 4 petals, and Dame, D-A-M-E, has 4 letters in the name. So these plants here are actually another one of my favorites because they're so neat. These plants are called Squirrel Corn, and they're in the same family as the ornamental bleeding hearts. They're also related to Dutchmans Breeches. Both Squirrel Corn and Dutchmans Breeches have these really neat little dangling flowers, whereas Dutchmans Breeches, the little top part will spread some more, almost to look like a pair of pantaloons. Squirrel Corn, I thought it got its name because the flower almost looks like a corn kernel, but in fact it gets its name from little structures on its roots that look like corn kernels. So this little yellow flower here was actually a new one to me before I looked it up earlier this week. This little flower here is called pale yellow Corydalis, and it's actually in the same family as Dutchmans Breeches and Squirrel Corn, which if you look at the leaves do look very similar to those species. So it took us a while, but we finally found what might be the last blooming Dutchmans Breeches here at the Bluffs. So you can see here, when you compare it to Squirrel Corn, the top of it spread out, and it's supposed to look like a pair of pantaloons that have been put out on a line to dry. And if we go down to the bottom of this rock, one of the other plants that we've had a hard time finding today because it stopped blooming is our cutleaf toothwort, which gets its name from these leaves that have these large indentations going into it. It's another early bloomer that's a white flower that has 4 petals, but they all appear to have finished before we came here. So one of the invasive plants that can threaten a lot of these native spring wildflowers is garlic mustard. And here along a roadway is where we find garlic mustard starting to move in. Like the name implies, garlic mustard is a mustard plant that, if you take one of the leaves and you crush it and smell it, smells and tastes a lot like garlic. You'll notice them in springtime as they start to shoot up and have these white flowers. Garlic mustard, individual plants can be controlled by hand pulling them, which is easy when the dirt is wet and moist. And if you come closer, you can take a look at those little white flowers, and you'll notice how the leaves are round to triangular shaped and have these large scalloped edges. When in doubt though, crush a leaf and smell it, and if it smells like garlic, you have the right guy. After pulling a plant, if they have any flowers on them, it's best to take this plant and throw it in a trash bag. After the flowers have opened, if they've been pollinated, a lot of these plants can continue to develop into seed, and we don't want that seed spreading. If left unchecked, plants like this can overwhelm the floor of a native forest and literally crowd out our native wildflowers. Garlic mustard is also known for what's called allelopathy. It will put chemicals into the soil, and some plants react to those by making it more difficult for them to grow there. And more research is ongoing and finding that it can also interrupt the mycorrhizae fungi that are in the soil that a lot of our trees actually have beneficial relationships with. So it can hamper new tree seedlings from growing as well. One of the most well-known spring wildflowers is called Spring Beauty. And it's called that because not only is it beautiful, but it's one of the first ones to come up in the year. So Spring Beauty has pretty simple flowers, 5 petals, and they're mostly white except for these little streaks of pink. There's some variability. You might find some that are paler, some that are darker, and you can tell it's a Spring Beauty because instead of having big broad leaves, they have long linear leaves that almost look like grass. I particularly like them because they bloom for a long time. You can see all of the past flowers that it used to have here before these finally opened. This is also one that you might find in a wide variety of spots. I've even seen them growing in people's lawns. So here you can see just starting to bloom one of our showier woodland wildflowers, the wild poppy, which has 4 large yellow petals. And if you take a look around, we have quite a few of them starting. Now, one of the reasons why spring is such a great time for wildflowers in forests have to do with where they're located. So a lot of these flowers we call spring ephemerals, and that's because they will come up in spring, they'll flower, they'll bloom, they'll have their foliage, and most of them will die back either partially or completely. You won't even see any leaves later in the year. And that's to take advantage of one of the things that plants need most, the sun. So if you've noticed from some of these portions of the video, most of our trees don't have leaves on them yet. That means that we're getting a lot of sunlight here on the forest floor that we don't in the middle of summer. And all of these little wildflowers are taking advantage of it. They have specifically developed to come out early in the year so they can get their sunlight, so they can produce all that energy that they need to flower, to produce seed, and to make new plants. So one of the neat things about coming to the Bluffs is sometimes you can find plants that almost exclusively grow on the rocks or the bluffs, or they're at least happier growing there. So this guy here, the walking fern was growing around him. This is the smooth rock cress. And smooth rock cress, it will grow in other areas, but as the name implies, it really likes growing on rocks. It has these little dangling flowers, but it also has leaves that practically join around the stem, which sets it apart. The plant that was trying to grow on it is a plant that exclusively likes growing on limestone or sandstone rocks, and it's called walking fern. It's a true fern, but it gets its name because it will have these really long leaves that go to a narrow tip, and those tips will root down, and then it will start again, another leaf, and then stretch to root down, and that way it essentially walks across the rock. So let's find some of those long ones. Here, it's rooting down right there. Here, come in and close and you can see actually. So here you got a leaf here that's stretching, and then it's rooted down right there, and a new little plant is forming. In among the moss, you can also see little plants like this. This guy is a southern fragile fern, or fragile fern. And they don't get super large, but they're one of the first ferns to come out. So while many of the other ferns are still unfurling and opening up, this guy is already out and green and growing along with all of the showier wildflowers. Here you can see a few of them that are still opening. Ferns that have not unfurled their leaves yet, these little guys here, these structures, are called fiddleheads. So, and in some larger species of fern, people actually like to cook the fiddleheads kind of like fresh asparagus, but these ones wouldn't be very good for that. If any of you are into the trend of gardening with succulents, you'll really appreciate this next plant. This right here is our native Sedum, and it is a native succulent that likes to grow on rocks. It usually grows just about exclusively on limestone and sandstone rocks, usually in clumps like this. Sometimes, here we go, you can find some itty bitty flowers, but the plants also just tend to spread through the root system to form big clumps like this. So the star-like flower that we have here is something that I didn't know until last year was a native wildflower. A lot of you might be familiar with weedy chickweed that you get all around your gardens or your driveway. It can be frustrating to pull up. Believe it or not, we also have a native chickweed. So this chickweed is a lot bigger than the invasive one, or well, not invasive, the weedy one. The flowers are bigger, they got lots of petals, it almost looks like a star, and just like the other chickweed, it'll have these pairs of opposite leaves going down the stem. Here we find it a little bit on the forest floor, but also going up onto the rocks. While some of our native wildflowers are really showy, others almost seem to blend in, like this bellwort. It almost gets covered up by the drooping leaves, and if you don't look closely, you just might miss it. Other wildflowers over here haven't started blooming yet, but if you know what to look for, you can tell what you might want to come back and catch. These large leaves here are one of the different water leaves that we have. And they get their name actually from this design on the leaf. It almost looks like they've been splattered with water or paint to get that splotched effect. Over here, the little chevron marks on here earn this plant its name. Lady Thumb, or I believe Virginia knotweed is the other one. It's a native plant, and these leaves actually lose that little chevron as the plant gets bigger. So this is the only time of year you can see them look just like that. So if you're watching this and thinking, there are so many wildflowers, I'll never learn how to identify all of them, don't worry, don't freak out. The first thing is to have a camera, because the nice thing about plants is plants don't move. You can take pictures of them, you can take the pictures home, you can figure out what beautiful thing you found later. Helpful field guides can also be a good source, as well as the Indiana Native Plant Society. I personally posted a few photos of plants on that Facebook group earlier this week, trying to identify what I thought was one of the water leaves, only to find out that this plant, now blooming, was something called forest or fernleaf fakelia, if I am pronouncing it correctly. And if I'm not, someone from the Native Plant Society, please correct me in the comments. So you might have noticed that throughout this video, I have referred to things by their common name. So not the scientific Latin name, but things like wild ginger or jack in the pulpit. There is a large variation when it comes to these. So if you're looking for a very specific species ID, maybe it's something that you'd like to plant at home or like to purchase, it is always a good idea to look something up, either using a field guide or some of our internet resources, to make sure that you have the right species. Here we have two different wildflowers, but only one that's blooming. So here we have purple Trillium. So just like the other white Trillium that we saw, it has these 3 leaves at the top, and it also has flowers with 3 petals. It's very similar to sessile Trillium. However, the sepals on that one are not curved down. They're flat up against the flower. And right here, it's not blooming yet, but Solomon's seal has just unfurled. That's why some of the leaves are still curled up. Later in the year, it will have little flowers and then berries or seeds right along the edge of it, hanging down. So some ferns have your traditional fern fronds that we've seen before, and we talked about the fiddleheads, but others, like this very delicate maidenhair's fern, will have a different design. This makes almost a little bitty crown, and while delicate, it's not quite to its full size yet. It is one of my favorite ferns that you will find in forest understories, and in my mind, a much underused one when it comes to landscaping. Underneath it, we see some of the leaves that we saw before that could be either squirrel corn or Dutchmans Breeches, and the two plants are pretty hard to distinguish when they're not blooming. And a few of these leaves here too. Another plant that seems to have stopped blooming before we came here to shoot this video is trout lily. Trout lilies often grow in big clumps, and they're known for these leaves that kind of have a mottled look to them. It's how they get their name, kind of almost like the skin of a trout looks. And they have beautiful lily-like flowers on them. And one of the ways you can also tell the difference is you often see a lot of single leaves, and those are plants that are not ready to flower yet. It's when you find a pair of two leaves together that you'll have a plant that's ready to bloom. Now, one of the reasons why when you go to a state nature preserve like this one, you might see signs telling you not to pick flowers and take them home with you is because a lot of our wildflowers can take years before they produce any seeds. So by picking those flowers, you're depriving a plant that has taken years to get to that point of being able to produce seeds and spread into new plants. While a lot of our wildflowers can spread underground from root systems, it's still a good idea to take pictures instead of taking flowers home with you. So every now and then you might see big clumps of white flowers, and when I came and scouted this place out at first, I thought that they were different anemones. We have a couple of different anemones, but once I looked closer, I realized that this plant here is actually what's called false rue anemone. So it has little white flowers. Oh, let's get one that's open. But if you count the petals, it always has 5 petals, whereas from reading, the different anemones can vary from 5 up to 10 petals per flower. It's highly variable. Second, the leaves will kind of go along the stem alternately, whereas on the actual rue anemone, it will be just one whorl of leaves right underneath the flower. So those are some helpful hints.